Welcome to Grace on Tap. Grace on Tap is a podcast dedicated to the history and the theology of the Lutheran Reformation, all over a nice cold beer. That was sort of a weak clink.
It was a weak clink, but we have a good beer, and we'll tell you about it during the beer break. We continue our discussion of the fourth commandment. We're starting at paragraph 108, and as we discuss the fourth commandment, we're starting to look at what it means to have honor for our father and our mother. And in this discussion is the whole role of the two kingdoms and what it means to understand the rule and reign of God, both in our earthly lives and our spiritual lives, the way he has ordered these lives to have honor and glory to be given to him as we look to whom he has placed as agents of his mercy and his order in our lives.
So, I'm just, one of the things that Luther says here is we are not to regard our parents, their persons. We had a lot of discussion last time on some of the complexity with this particular commandment. And so I guess if you want to get the full picture, go back to that. We're not going to revisit all those discussions, but just diving in here, it says we're not to regard their persons, how they may be, but the will of God who has thus created and ordained. And what I think Luther is getting at there is that God puts people in positions of authority over us, and that's whether we're talking about our parents or anybody else that God has ordained to put in a position of authority. And this is where we get into the two kingdoms, because God puts people in positions of authority over us, whether we're talking about the work world, or we're talking about government, or we're talking about so many other domains. God places those people, whether we like it or not. We have to recognize that those people have been placed in those positions of authority over us for a reason. And so that's really what this is all about. I remember, and I don't have it in my notes here, but after we're done with the catechism, one of the things I would like to get into is the postals, Luther's postals. And there's a point in here in the postals where Luther is talking about when some of the rulers who were placed, whether it's Pontius Pilate or some of the more or less worthy, quote unquote, worthy leaders who were placed over the Jews in the New Testament, and how God chose those people, how God chose the Romans to be in authority over the Jews, and some of the reasons that Luther saw as the reasons for that. And so this is something that's a whole nother episode, but it's all intertwined with this idea of God ordaining those who are put in positions of authority over us.
Luther's starting to put into perspective the reason we will honor somebody is not rooted in who they are in their quality of person or in the work that they do, but primarily we honor people because that is the persons that God has placed in our lives. And so the honor we give to people is not rooted in what we see in the person in front of us, but in the trust that God is at work, that God is at work in the way he's ordered this world. And so that when dealing with our parents, we're going to remember that is the will of God that we have parents, and he has ordained us to be the children and for them to be our parents. And that perspective or lens or worldview of how we will see people in authority is one that I think, for instance, I've heard this statement that trust is earned. That, someone will say, you know what, until you earn it, I'm not going to trust you. And I find that so disconcerting because I realize that there's a certain credibility that has to be built up. We have to establish our bona fides with people. But ultimately, the reason that we are at work in each other's lives is because God has called us to be in this spot. And if you're not going to listen, or if you're not going to obey, or if you're not going to do what you are called to do because you haven't learned who that person is yet, that means that your organizing principle for trust is yourself. How different it is if the organizing principle of who I will trust is not what I see, but in the trust that God is at work. Now, others may call that naive, or they may say, well, you're just setting yourself up to be taken advantage of by people. But I think there is an incredible just freedom of joy and life that's found when we look at one another as someone that God has put there.
So, probably the most obvious example of that is is the parent. Obviously, God has given you to your parents. God has given your parents to you. And this isn't by some accident of politics or accident of one person placing another person in authority over you. This is the most obvious example of God at work placing you in the care of this person. And so it's in that relationship between parent and child that we learn about authority, about trusting God and his wisdom in placing us under the authority of those who are not perfect. And I think that's there is there is no place in the Bible where it says parents are perfect. I mean, that's we are all sinners, and so there's this recognition that the person we're dealing with in this position of authority is a sinner, and part of our learning how to be humble before God is to learn that humility with our parents.
All right, so where we want to get to is talking about three things that Luther describes as honor your parents. And as he goes through the things that it means to understand what this commandment requires is first to understand that your parents are the most precious treasure on earth, that we value them as a precious treasure. We hold them, we care for them, we look up to them, we hold them in that kind of esteem. Second, we will behave with modesty or respect towards them. We're going to avoid treating them roughly, haughtily, or defiantly. Yield to them, be silent, even if they go too far. And that last bullet item is even if they go too far is a point of just to understand that every time our parents do something that we don't like is not the occasion for us to act out or to speak up. In fact, it's just a moment of humility to submit to them and hold your tongue. I think that quality of learning when to hold one's tongue is learned in the way we relate to our parents. And it's a skill we'll need throughout life as well.
So the last one there is to honor them by our works. And gladly, Luther talks about doing it gladly and with humility and reverence, to serve, help, and provide for them when they are sick, infirm, or poor. And this is getting into, and we've talked about it before, part of a huge part of the Christian life is the freedom of the Christian and the freedom Christ gives us to love our neighbor, that we're no longer constrained by the things of this world so much, and our own desire for self-glorification. We find our glorification in Christ. And so that gives us the freedom, and we learn that. Part of the learning of doing that is in this caring for our parents, caring for the people that God has, and as they grow old, as they grow, where they need us to be there for them, and that's a big part of learning. Again, all of this is about learning our role in the world, and so that's part of honoring the parents, is to care for them when they need us.
And doing that kind of work with humility and reference to learn how to serve, to help, and to provide for someone when they're sick or poor, and to do it in such a way that it's done out of reverence for the integrity of that person, and not because we're receiving some sort of reward or inheritance at the end of it, but just simply because that is the work that God has called us to do. Then Luther goes on to describe how this is a great work that's given to children. And he spends quite a bit of time highlighting this part of this command that's given by God to children.
So
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I'll just give a quick quote here. Thus, there would be no need of inventing monasticism nor spiritual orders, but every child would have abided by this commandment. And and this is, and he'll go into this. I think we'll get into it a little bit later, but he talks about these Carthusians, and I had to actually look up the Carthusians, who they were. They're still around, as a matter of fact. And this is a group that they dedicate their lives to solitary prayer. There's about 450 of them or so in the modern right now. That's spread out all over the world, both men and women, Catholic monks. And the I think where Luther is really railing against them and is because from what I've read of that era when Luther was writing this, and Evan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but of course you didn't have the social safety net that we have today in Luther's era. And so these people were walking away from their responsibility to their parents, and their parents might not have had anybody else to rely on. And they were walking away so that they could go and pray for the world and, giving up their responsibilities to their parents. Now, the Carthusians today aren't in the same situation, but I think Luther is making a point there that's still valid, where there are people who are, very, very, very holy in the eyes of the world, but they're dropping out when it comes to this particular commandment, where they're not, everybody says, "Oh, what a holy person," but they don't take care of their parents because nobody sees it, and nobody's going to give them a pat on the back over it.
We might think of it as just an everyday mundane activity, but Luther points out that unfortunately it's become despised and brushed aside, and no one recognizes it as God's command, as a holy divine word and teaching. And instead, they take this work of being a child who honors and respects parents as something that could almost be pushed aside. And for Luther, his concern is that when we push aside the very basic fundamental commands of God to do something that we've self-crafted for our own glory, we're headed down a very dangerous path of moving away from trusting in the righteousness that we receive from Christ and instead seeking to establish our own holiness. That experience you describe about the Carthusians during Luther's time wasn't new in Luther's time either. Jesus himself is talking about the concerns that he has about those who have disregarded the commandment to honor parents by calling the things of this world as korban and instead seek to serve their own righteousness.
It really is. And honestly, I can't name any examples of this just because it's the type of thing that when people take care of their parents, it's not something they talk about. It's something that is just like done and you don't think about it. And so when they don't take care of their parents, when they're, when they allow their parents to suffer, while they're out doing, quote unquote, godly things, that also isn't discussed. And so this is the sort of the hidden good works of God, that only He sees too often. Well,
Mm-hmm.
but that, and that's so. I suspect that this is still common in this day. It was common in Christ's day. It was common in Luther's day. It might not be as obvious in today's era, but I'm sure it's still happening a lot. And
I'm
you might
sure
be more familiar with it than me.
many families struggle with how to care for their parents, whether you have one sibling that's nearer to that parent and they end up carrying the heavy load,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then you have the sibling that's lives far away. They swoop in for a week and they work really hard during that week and they think they've done a lot, and then they leave and don't recognize that everyone else who's close by has been doing everything every day. And I think it's a very difficult dynamic because it is pretty common for one sibling to take on the caretaker role as parents get older, but how that gets shared or communicated or encouraged by the other siblings, I think seems to be the greatest tension I experience as a pastor. And I understand the difference between living close and far away right now because my brother lives much closer to my mom and my stepdad than I do. And so Andy ends up doing a lot more of just dropping by and saying hi than I'm able to do. And
Right.
so then when I'm in town and I'm there and I'm working really hard at maybe the yard or something like that, I leave and think, oh, I did a really good job. And then I have to think about the fact that Andy's there every week.
Yeah. Yeah. You just gave him a small break, a 1 week break maybe, but he's back to the grind. So,
And
and
so,
that's,
go ahead. It's just that dynamic of how parents and children relate to one another in those times of caretaking that I think is the highest tension.
yeah. Yeah. One of the things, and I said at the beginning of the podcast here that I didn't want to get into the whole some of the complexity with this particular commandment with the quote unquote uh, evil parents, and but there was a throwaway line that I thought was really helpful that I want to just quickly touch on, and then let's go to a beer break, and that was in paragraph 116 where Luther gives some limits on the obedience we should show to our parents. And he says, if God's word and will are in force and being accomplished, nothing shall be esteemed higher than the will and word of parents, yet so that it too is subordinated to obedience toward God. And so he doesn't go into it any further, but if your parents are telling you to steal or kill or lie, then there are limits to
Hmm.
what you need to do. And that gives us, even for those who find themselves with very, very difficult parents, it gives some guidelines to the limit and puts limitations of boundaries around this obedience to parents. Obedience to parents is for to express obedience to God. And if the parents place themselves above God, then it's time to say no. And that's with respect and dignity and love, but it's time to say no. And that was that's sort of a, in that one sentence, at least that's what I got out of it.
Mike,
So
I think you really explained something very important right there, that our good works to others are meant to be in obedience to God, to give glory to Him. But when that work towards others becomes something other than God, uh, glorifying God, then that work itself is dangerous. And so how we care for our parents, um, and how we follow their will and their word, ultimately the lens through which I figure out, am I going to do this or am I not? That checklist of, does this make sense? The author of that checklist is God.
amen.
All right,
I
so
think
we've
that's
got a beer today, and we've got the Oberon. It's a summer wheat ale from Bell's Brewery in Comstock, Michigan, and it has 4 ingredients. And Mike and I were talking about these 4 ingredients earlier. If you go to the Bell's website, you'll find that they have videos explaining the ingredients of and what they contribute to a beer. So you can watch a 50-second video on the importance of water in beer, the quality of the water, and the importance of that water, and then the wheat. And he describes the brewer describes wheat like the sun, bringing warmth to the beer. And then the hops in the Oberon, it's not just a fruit; it's something that builds the base of the beer. And then bringing everything together in the beer is the yeast, and they use for their yeast their in-house um, ale yeast. And so I was very surprised reading about the ingredients of the Oberon that it was only 4, because I thought for certain there was spices, there was fruit, that it was kind of an engineered beer, but it is in fact one of those just great basic summer beers that has a wonderful flavor and just has great ingredients. Only 4 ingredients: wheat, water, hops, and yeast.
I've been looking forward to this episode, and I wanted to do it actually earlier. I've talked a little bit about how come summertime, I I know IPAs are a summertime beer for a lot of people, just not for me. I just don't like IPAs in the summertime. I like to go toward the wheat beers, the summer shandies, those kinds of thing. And the Oberon is my favorite summer beer, and I'm not the only one. They have in Michigan, on the first day of spring, they uh, they have Oberon parties all through Michigan and Comstock, but elsewhere where people celebrate the release of Oberon, and then it's the Oberon is the this Bell's Oberon is a favorite, and I'm glad we're finally getting it into our rotation here. It's been summer for a couple weeks now, and but it's really I'm really happy to be having an Oberon during this episode. So this is my summer beer, and I'm gonna enjoy it.
And I am glad we're enjoying this beer as well. The bottle and the can will have a picture of a sun on it, kind of a reminder that the Oberon is the color and the scent of a sunny afternoon.
All right. Well, cheers.
Cheers. So we return back to our discussion of the fourth commandment. We were discussing the will and word of parents ultimately is subordinated to the obedience towards God. And that is really a great just method of figuring out anything we're called to do in relationship to others in this world, that we are maybe a subordinate to someone, we are under someone's position of authority, and we're trying to figure out, do I listen to this boss? Do I listen to this cop? Do I listen to this president? Do I listen to this general? Do I listen to this parent? Whatever someone is in authority over you, it must always be measured against who you are called to be as a child of God.
So after Luther finishes up that little section where he puts he puts those boundaries around this commandment, he goes back into really talking about how great the commandment is, and he just doesn't seem like he can get enough of talking about how great this commandment is. And I think that's partly because it is so neglected and always has been so neglected, that Luther really does hammer on this. And so he's starting in paragraph 127, he starts talking about the earthly benefits of this commandment. And he says he talks about how it's easy to take, just like it's easy to take God's love and provision for granted, it's easy to take our parents' love and provision for granted. And that's as we become more sensitive to our parents' love and provision, it helps us once again to recognize God, both in the work of our parents and in the work of others who love and provide for us. And it's just the selfishness of our hearts that we tend to think that everything is because of us, but this commandment does help us in this world, sort of takes what is spiritual, that spiritual appreciation for God, and makes it very concrete by focusing us on looking at the love and provision of our parents, and then hopefully that's going to translate into recognizing it from God down the road.
He points out that it seems easy for all of these blessings that we have from those whom God has placed in our lives to be wiped from our memories, when an evil comes. When an evil arrives in our lives, we start to imagine that everything else that was before it was worthless, or was just vanity, or just a lie. And so when an evil moment arrives and we look at what someone has done in our lives and we just neglect everything else that's happened. And I think that's a good recognition that he has of that power of evil to just wipe away the good. Maybe you've seen this in the way you provide encouragement to others and correction and that necessity of sandwiching any words of correction with considerable words of praise and acknowledgement of what they've been able to accomplish beforehand. And I see it with my children more and more as I think about how after a sport, after they've played in a game or wrestled in a match, and how I'm going to address what I know they did wrong. Do I even have to bring it up? Maybe I might bring it up, but first I'm going to spend considerable time making sure my words don't bring harm to them.
And that's something that, when the evil hour comes, it is easy to forget. There's so many of us who, when we find ourselves in a valley of some sort, it's easy to despair, and yeah, he's absolutely right. We do tend to forget all the great blessings that have been given to us, and it takes a lot of faith in those moments to consider all the great blessings that are ours.
So then Luther spends paragraphs 131 to 139 to discuss the promise that's attached to this commandment, that thou mayest live long upon the land which the Lord thy God has giveth thee.
So I'm going to just read from paragraph 134, and this is direct from Luther. For to have long life in the sense of the Scriptures is not only to become old, but to have everything which belongs to long life, such as health, wife, and children, livelihood, peace, good government, etc., without which this life can neither be enjoyed in cheerfulness nor long endured. And now, it's funny because, and I was actually wondering about this, Evan, as I was reading through this. Is this a reference to if we corporately, if we as a people go through and live according to this commandment, where we honor those who have been placed in authority above us? It seems like society would be more well ordered, and that that we would have all these great benefits, more likely to have these great benefits if we really did within the boundaries of God's law, especially, if all those people in positions of authority were working within the boundaries of God's law.
Well, he sees this commandment as the disobedience of this commandment, the violation of this commandment at its seed is the origin of any other kind of disobedience that we will have to anybody else. He goes on to say in paragraph 137, why do we have so many scoundrels who must daily be hanged, beheaded, or broken on the wheel, if not because of disobedience? And so his conclusion is that because we don't value the way a child should honor his parent, this leads people to later on in life to just take for granted that disobedience is fine. Yeah. But in fact, they'll be caught on it.
Yeah. It's funny how, and I keep going back to if we corporately followed, and especially in Luther's time, where society was still, we're in a post-Christian society now, or almost. If we're not there, we're darn close to a post-Christian society. But in Luther's time, it was a strongly Christian society. That whole, from the emperor on down, these were devout people who were mostly arguing about one of their major arguments was about the meaning of God's truth. And it's one of those things that, if people acted, again, I'm going to draw that same boundary Luther does. If people in authority acted within with regard to God's law, they didn't cheat, they didn't steal, they didn't They didn't murder, they didn't, they were honest, all the different things that are in God's law. And then the people, were obedient to them. How much better the life is for everybody. And is that what God is promising here? Is that
Well, he says that. He says the godly and obedient, however, receive this blessing in that they live long in peace and quietness. They
yeah,
will get to see their children's children, as stated, to the third and fourth generation. As we know from experience, where there are fine old families who prosper and have many children, it is because some of them were brought up well and honored their parents. On the other hand, the wicked will not know this posterity. Uh, Therefore, let it be a warning. It is important to the obedience of God to treasure our relationship with our parents.
I think we'll be closing up shop here very soon, but I'm going to get this last one, which is just a short little comment Luther makes, and he doesn't really expand on it very much, but he says, we all think we understand what it means to love and honor our parents, and none of us do. And he in paragraph 140 he touches on that, how we all take this commandment for granted, and thinking that, oh yeah, I got that covered. And this is going to be sort of the case for many of the commandments going forward. Yeah, I've never murdered. Yeah, I've never stolen. And there's going, but this is the first one that he really, at least I don't recall him saying. Maybe he did say it in the previous ones, but he touches on it here again, which is that, yeah, we think this is easy, but not really. It's not. It's very, very difficult, and we think we understand it, and once again, no, not really. So
When
that's
we pass over lightly the things of God that we think are simple or are basic and we've already got it covered, and then we pass on to those things that we think we fasten our attention to other things that we think are more glorious, more difficult, more challenging, more rewarding. We will fail to perceive and believe how God has been work in even those most base moments. And I think that's one of the things I enjoy about his explanations of the commandments, is he takes them back to these basic things and just says, these are the simple things of God. Do these simple things, and you will find a glorious way of how God is at work in your life. Move past these too quickly and try to move up a level and advance yourself up to greater and greater heights of glory without first establishing this foundation, and you will find that you are quickly going to fall.
Amen. Well, I had great hopes that we would be able to get through the fourth commandment in this episode, but not to be. So we will pick this up episode 3 on the fourth commandment, and hopefully we'll pick up the pace again in future ones. So I want to say thank you to all of you for listening. If you want to get in touch with us, shoot us an email or go to our website. And Evan, you have that memorized better than I do.
GraceUntapped-podcast.com. It's a website where every episode is posted, often with a little bit more background information. That's also a spot where we had a listener ask on Facebook, if I have a question about something you've discussed in one of your podcast episodes, where should I ask that question? And I said to Tom, a great spot to ask that question is in the comments of that post on our website, because then we can write related to where that podcast episode is posted, have this dialogue of questions. And especially as we find people are listening to episodes that we recorded 2 years ago, and if we can put those questions right near that article on the website, it makes us easier to kind of respond and know what they're asking about as well.
Very good. Well, thanks again for listening. Prost.